Hi everyone, in this video we will be working on this shimmery multi-strand loomed bracelet, and this is the fourth project of this series, and it looks like this, and it uses the same bead set that I have put together, which is available in my Ko-fi shop. So if you would like to support my channel, I will put a link in the description section below as well as in the comments section. So after this project, you will have only a little bit left of all the other colors except for the silver lined gold. You'll still have about 40% of this tube left, but hang on to it because I will be using it in future projects and tutorials and designs. And another thing I wanted to mention is that for the remaining colors, if you do have any beads left, I will have a side project video for you next that will use up these beads in such a way that it will complement all the loomed bracelets pretty well. So for this multi-strand bracelet pattern, let me explain how it works. So on each end of the bracelet, there are 6 rows that are fully beaded across. Then starting from the 7th row, the multi-strand beading starts. So there's a strand that is 3 beads wide, and then it skips a column, and then a strand that is 5 beads wide, and then it skips another column, and then finally a third strand that is also 5 beads wide. So the important thing to remember about this project is that when you are adjusting for your wrist size, you want to reduce from either end evenly, and then you want to make sure that the first 6 rows on either end are beaded fully, meaning they are completely attached, meaning no beads are being skipped. So you're beading the full row before they are separated out into their own individual strands. So for example, I have a 5.5 inch wrist size, and I prefer to have a final size of 6 inches. So for a bracelet size of 6 inches, I need a beaded section of 5 inches because you need to leave 1 inch for the clasp. So over on this guide sheet, I have already done 6 inches, 5.5 inches, and 5 inches. So you can see that the 5-inch bracelet is only 75 rows as opposed to 89 rows for the 6 inches. So from the 75 rows, I've made it so that 6 rows on either side are fully beaded with no gaps. So that way, the 3 separate strands are attached to something before they get separated out into their own individual 3-row, 5-row, and 5-row strands, respectively. So for the sake of this video, I'm just going to flash the 6-inch version that you can take a screenshot of, but you can also download the high-resolution versions on my Ko-fi page for your devices or for printing out. And again, this guide sheet will show you sort of what I mean by having the last 6 rows fully attached before branching out into individual strands. So yeah, let's get started. So for this project, I'm going to be using 2 kinds of thread. The first is Ceylon D in the color gold, and the second is Bead Good Thread in the color white. Now I know that this is the first time that I'm using Ceylon D on this channel, so to tell you more about it, it's a very strong and durable beading thread, but you can't get this from Michaels. You have to order it from an online bead store or see if a local bead shop carries it. So it works well for warp strands because it's not very stretchy, and the benefit of using Ceylon D is that it comes in tons of colors. So the color of Ceylon D that I will be using is gold because I want my edges to be gold because it's gonna look better because it matches better with the silver lined gold beads that will be predominant in this design. And I'll be using this also for the horizontal weft thread so that it will continue to match the edges. For my middle warp strands, so the warp strands that are not on the edges, I will be using my Bead Good Thread in white. Now you can use Ceylon D for all of your warp strands, but I'm choosing to use the second color because I feel like for instruction purposes, it'll be easier to see what I'm doing if I separate out the 3 designs with the two colors of warp strands. So just for instruction purposes, it will just be a lot clearer to see what I'm doing if there are two different warp strand colors. So if Ceylon D is not available, then another good alternative for warp strand would be the Coats & Clark upholstery thread. It is 100% bonded nylon, so it's also very strong and not stretchy. And it doesn't come in gold, I don't think, but you can get it in a tan or a light brown or beige color. But the only thing about this thread is that it is a bit thick, so you can't use it as a horizontal weft thread, so the thread that goes through the beads. For that, you could get something like a John Bead Good Thread, which comes in an off-white color called Ivory. So the John Bead Good Thread, you can use that for both the warp and the weft thread. So if you can only get one, then the John Bead Good Thread would be a good option. So the way that we're going to be warping for this project is going to be a little bit different and slightly trickier than how we normally do it, because if you look, it's almost like we have three different bracelets that we are doing the warp for, because I want to double the first and the last warp strands of each individual strand. So that means that for this design, for the 3-row design that's coming up first, I'm going to be doubling the first and the fourth warp strand of this design, and then the 5th and the 10th to do the 5-row strand, and then the 11th and the 16th warp strand to do the second 5-row design. So once again, we're going to be doubling warp strands number 1, 4, 5, 10, 11, and 16. So I'll show you how to do that now. So the first thing I'm going to do is the gold part, which is the Ceylon D, and I'm going to make a double knot to secure this thread. And I'm going to need 16 warp strands for this 15-row design. So I want to center my piece. So I'm going to do 8 strands on the left and 8 on the right for the total of 16. So to count from the middle, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I'm going to put my first warp strand there. And I'm going to also do the same for the bottom. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I'm going to put my thread in this slot. And then I'm just going to loop around this knob like this. Just loop it around. And I'm going to double that first warp strand. Like this. So now this first warp strand is doubled. So I'm just going to loop around. And the next one that we want to double is number 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm going to double this number 4. So I'm going to go back into the same slot to double it. So now number 4 is doubled. Now I need to double number 5. So I'm going to go to the 5th slot and warp that. And then I'm going to go around and go back to the same slot to double number 5. The next strand that I need to double is number 10. So 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So this is the 10th slot. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So I'm just going to go to the other side now and wind that around like that and go back into the same 10th slot to double that. So now this 10th slot is doubled. The next slot I need to double is 11, so I'm going to go into the next slot. go around and back into the same slot to double it. Like that. And now the last strand that I need to double is strand number 16. So 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So this one. (11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16). So now that I have done all of my gold warp strands and made sure that they're all doubled, I'm going to go ahead and cut off some of my thread and wind it around a couple times and make a couple of knots to secure it. Alright, so let's just review what this should look like. So these are my doubled gold warp strands. So I have doubled warp strands at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16. So 1, 4, 5, 10, 11, and 16. Because the first strand is a 3-row design, and then the second strand is a 5-row design, and then the third strand is another 5-row design. So to continue, I'm going to fill in all of the middle warp strands with John Bead Good Thread in the color white using just single strands. And so I need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So I need 10 warp strands worth of thread. So since I won't be able to pass this giant spool of thread through this space, I'm just going to estimate how much thread I'm going to need by running my thread back and forth 10 times. So it'll be like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then I'm going to do a little bit extra for security. So this is how much I have, and I'm going to start warping by doing the same thing and tying a double knot and going back and forth until I get to the 15th slot. Alright, so for this part, I'm just going to share a tip, and that is that because really long John Bead Good Thread tangles quite easily, what I ended up doing was tying a double knot on the open loop area of one of my bead tubes and then winding my thread around the tube. And because the tube is really narrow, it's very easy to get it in between that open space so that I can loop it around and do my warp strands that way. So that's what I'm doing over here. And then when you get to the middle, you just want to make sure that you also wind it around on the other knob on the right side so that you can wind your warp strands evenly on the left knob and on the right knob. And then to finish up, as usual, we're just going to cut the thread and wind it a couple of times around this bar and tie a couple of knots. Easy peasy. Alright, so here's a final look at what the warp setup should look like. So we have here gold, white, white, gold, gold, white, 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 gold, gold, white, 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 gold. And so as you can see, the warp strands are a bit on the flimsy side, so I'm going to use our trick of using a thick, strong sewing needle and not your beading needle because that needle is too thin and flimsy. So you're just going to use a thick, strong sewing needle to pull the warp strands out a bit and put a Sharpie through this area. And what that's going to do is stretch out your warp strands and give it some more tension. So as you can see now, the strands are quite tight and they're ready for beading. Alright, so now that we're done with the warping, let's get to looming. And I switched over my bead mat to this light green one because I'm using my other one currently for a personal project. So for the horizontal weft thread, as I've mentioned previously, I will be using my Ceylon D in the color gold so that I could better match my edges. And I'm going to cut myself about a 4 or 4.5 foot length of the Ceylon D. So it's a little shorter than what I usually do, because this first section that we're going to loom is quite narrow, so I don't really need that much to get very far. So the first thing I'm going to do is leave a 6 to 8 inch tail, and I'm also going to tie a very simple overhand knot, so a simple regular knot. And I'm doing this on the leftmost strand because I am right-handed, but if you are left-handed, then you can do it on the rightmost strand and basically do everything in reverse. So after I tie the overhand knot, I'm just going to slide it about 1.5 inches to 2 inches from this edge over here, and then I'm going to put the rest of this longer tail under all my vertical warp strands like this. So we'll tuck in all of these tails later. For now, I've put in the longer strand on a size 10 beading needle, and I'm going to put on my first row. So on the pattern, I will be working from left to right, bottom to top, because I'm right-handed. But if you are left-handed, then you will be reading the pattern from right to left, bottom to top. So here's my first row of beads. It's all gold, and I'm going to slide it down. So to start putting them on, what I'll do is I'll put a bead in each of the space, starting from the right, and I'm going to put my needle over the vertical warp strands. So this horizontal thread right now is under all of the vertical warp strands, so now I'm going to go over. So you're going to push the bead up with your finger, and you're going to put one bead in each spot and put your needle over the vertical strand and through the beads. And I'm going to do the second one in the second slot and put my needle through that one. And the third one in the third slot and put my needle through. And keep going until I get to the very end. And the reason I'm doing one at a time from the right side and just slowly positioning my beads across is so that I can fix these beads into their respective spaces first, and that way I don't have to worry about them anymore, and I can just focus on doing all the rest of these other beads as we go. So just keep going until you reach the very end, putting one bead in each of the spaces. So when you're done putting your needle through all the beads, you're just gonna pull your needle through and also pull the thread through. And right now, because the spaces are very wide, it's gonna be very hard to pull your horizontal weft thread to snug down all of these vertical strands. So we're gonna need to just move these vertical strands to consolidate them so that it'll get narrower and it'll be easier to pull this horizontal thread to make your vertical strands fit the beads better. So for that, I'm going to be using my tapestry needle. I prefer using a tapestry needle because the edge is blunt and it scratches up the wood less, but you don't have to use a tapestry needle. You can just use a regular thick, strong sewing needle. And definitely do not use your beading needle because that's just too flimsy. So this isn't an exact science. We're really just trying to narrow down this area. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put my white thread and move that to this slot. So now there's 2 white threads in a single slot. And then I'm going to move this white thread 1 slot over. And then I'm going to put this white thread also with the other white thread. So now there's 2 in a single slot. And then I'm going to move this gold thread. And I think that this gold thread can have its own slot. And then for this other gold thread, I'm gonna also move it to its own slot 1 over, like that. And then the 2 white threads, I'm going to consolidate them into a single slot. And then I'm also gonna move this double strand gold thread into its own slot, like that. And for this left side, I'm going to move the white threads together like this. And I'm going to put the gold thread in its own slot. So what I've done is I've just consolidated all the white threads into their own slots and then moved all the threads close together, and hopefully this will be good enough to make it easier to tighten the weft threads. So that is currently okay. So I'm going to do the other side. So for this other side, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to put the two white strands together, and then I'm going to move this white strand one slot over like that. And then I'm also going to put this white strand right in the same slot as the other white one. And then I'm going to move this double gold thread into its own slot. So for these left 4 strands, at first I moved them right next to the other strands, but then I changed my mind and I actually moved them one over to the left so that there is one empty slot in between the left 4 and the rest of the warp strands. And the reason that I did it this way is because this left section represents our first strand in this multi-strand bracelet, and I wanted to keep this separate because this is the first part that we're going to be beading, and it will just be a lot easier to bead just this section if it's a little bit offset from the other ones. But later we're going to still consolidate a little bit more to the right side, and you'll see what I mean when we get to the later part of the looming process. So for now, I'll do the other side. So I'm just gonna consolidate all the white strands together like this. And then I'm gonna put this double strand into its own slot. So now that we've consolidated all of the thread, it's gonna be a lot easier to pull this weft thread to cinch up your warp strands to fit the beads better. But it's not going to be totally secure until we do the second row, so let's do the second row. So I will put all my thread under the warp strands again. Alright, so here's my second row, and the colors of your second row are going to be different depending on the length of beaded section that you are doing, because I have them all starting at different spots based on the length that you're doing. So I'm just going to do the same thing, and I'm going to push a bead up into each of the spaces, and I'm going to put my needle over the warp strands and through each of the beads. And make sure you don't pierce any of your warp strands. So just keep your needle up to make sure that your needle is going over. So once you pull your needle through, you're gonna be able to just tighten both the first and the second row. So here's the extra thread from the first row. I'm just gonna pull until that thread tightens up. And as you can see, once I've done my second row, my spacing is a lot more secure and it's no longer stretching out and opening up again. So to make sure that my first row stays straight and doesn't get moved around like this, I'm going to take a spare size 10 beading needle, and I'm going to put this through the first row to secure it further and to align it better, like this. And now I can flush my second row against that first row to keep it straight. So from here, I'm going to continue beading the next 4 rows before we branch out into the different strands. So this is my 6th row, so I'm just popping my beads up and I'm going to put my needle through. And pull on my thread. And now we're gonna start the multi-strand bit, because in the pattern from here on in, they're gonna be separately woven. So I'm just gonna start with my 3-row strand right here. Alright, so to start our 3-row strand, I'm going to put all my thread under the vertical warp strands like we normally do, and I'm going to pick up the first 3 beads for this 3-row pattern. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to slide it all the way down to where that strand is, and I'm going to pop up the beads through the spaces like what we normally do. And instead of going over like this with my needle and my thread, I'm gonna go up into the space between these 2 edges right here, and I'm going to put my needle through those 3 beads and pull. And when I do that, what's going to happen is my horizontal left thread is going to hook around only this edge. So I'm going to do another row. So again, I'm going to slide down my next row, which is 3 white beads, and pop those 3 beads up through the respective spaces, and again put my needle through the space between these 2 edges and through all of those beads. So it's almost like I am only weaving this strand separately. So when I pull my horizontal left thread, it's only going to create this section. And so that's the reason why I kept this section separated and I did not consolidate them when I was doing the upper section of these warp strands, because this gap is going to help you later on as you go further up your pattern to more clearly delineate where you should be putting your needle up in order to just bead this section. So I'm just gonna do one more row as an example. So here's my next row, and I'm going to pop up those 3 beads. Again, I'm only gonna put my needle between these 2 edges, and I'm going to put my needle through those 3 beads and only weave this section. So from here, you're gonna keep weaving this 3-row section all the way up. And I'll meet you back when we are done weaving just this part, and we'll do this connected piece before going into the middle section. Alright, so this is actually the last row of my 5-inch beaded section, and I'm going to now start weaving the top section that is attaching all of the strands. But for now, I'm going to consolidate the strings on top that we didn't do in the beginning. So as you can see, not doing that allows you to have a wider gap between this left strand and the other ones, so that it would be easier to separate this out and just bead this separately. But now that we have to attach everything, we need the strings to be a little bit closer together. So I'm just going to move this gold edge over 1 slot to the right. And then I'm going to put the 2 white strands into its own single slot. and then I'm going to move this gold strand over to its own slot. So now the top warp strands should pretty much match how it looks in the bottom. So to do the attached section, I'm just going to put on the beads for this row. And now I'm going to do the same thing as the beginning and put the beads into their spaces and string them along from right to left. And then I'm just going to pull my thread through. And just like in the beginning, it's going to be hard to tighten this without doing another row. So let's do another row. So here's my second row, and I'm just going to do the same thing and put them into their proper spots and put my needle over the warp strands and through each of the beads. And when I pull my thread, I'm also going to tighten it so that the first and the second rows are cinched up and the warp strands are fitting the spaces nicely according to the size of the beads. Now I'm just going to take my bottom alignment needle and I'm going to put it on this first row to secure it and also to align that one. And now I'm going to bead the next 4 complete rows. Alright, so I've just finished beading my 6 connected rows. So I'm just gonna sew down and I'm going to start the middle section and also skip 1 column. So first I'm just gonna take out this alignment needle so it's not in my way. And the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go into the second row and put my needle through all of the gold beads like this and come out this way. And then I'm gonna go down 1 row and go into the opposite direction and come out again of my gold beads like this. And then I'm going to go back down 1 row and I'm going to sew in the opposite direction and also come out of my gold beads over here like this. And then I'm going to go back down 1 row and go in the opposite direction. And this time I will exit one of the white beads over here. I'm just going to go slightly past the gold section. And then I'm going to go down 1 and I'm going to come out of the first gold bead over here. Alright, so I've just brought you in a little bit closer so I can just review what I've done. So I came out of here and I went down 1 row and sewed back in the opposite direction, came out of this gold bead, went down, sewed into the opposite direction, came out of this gold bead, went back down, sewed in the opposite direction, came out of this gold bead, went back down and sewed in the opposite direction, and this time I came out of one of the white beads, and then now I'm going back down and I'm going to sew 3 beads until I come out of the first gold bead over here. So your thread is going to come out of that 4th column bead. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Now you're going to put your needle into this gap. So it's going to be the gap between the 2 gold edges. So just put your needle down that gap like this. And now I'm going to go left to right and go down my pattern. So once you've put your thread through that gap, you're going to pick up the next 5 beads that are the row below this middle section, because now we're doing this middle section. So it's going to be 5 beads, and you're going to pop it up into their proper spaces. And the proper spaces are the ones that are between the 2 gold double strand edges. So you're going to skip this whole column, and when you skip that column, the beads should be sitting in their proper spots like this. And to secure them, I'm going to put my needle between the 2 edges. So right next to the strand, next to the last bead, like this, like that. And now I'm going to put my needle through all of the beads like how we normally do. And as you can see, there's my needle, right? Instead of pulling through over this left 3-row strand, I'm going to actually put my needle under it, because that's just gonna make the process go a lot faster. If I can just pull my needle under this narrow strand and just be under all of my vertical warp strands, so I can start the next row in this 5-row section like that. So let's do that again. So I've picked up my next 5 beads and I've slid them down, and again we are going to pop them up into their respective slots into this 5-strand section like this. And I'm going to bring my needle in between the edges like that. Now I'm going to put my needle through all of the beads like this, and I'm going to bring it under my 3-strand section and pull. And now my thread and my needle is automatically under all of the vertical warp strands like that. And we'll do one more. So here's one more row, and I'm going to do the same as I did before and pop everything up, put my needle in between the 2 gold edges like that, and bring my thread over and put it under. So you're just going to keep going, and I'll meet you back if you run out of thread or you make it to the bottom, whichever comes first. Alright, so I have about 6 to 8 inches of thread left, so I'm going to put on some new thread. So I'm just going to leave this old thread alone, and I'm going to cut myself about 4.5 to 5 feet of new thread, and I'm going to do the same as we did when we first started the looming. And I'm going to tie a knot on the leftmost strand of this section that we are doing. And I'm going to make sure to leave myself a 6 to 8 inch tail so that I can weave that in later on. And I'm going to put the rest of the longer piece of this thread under all of the vertical warp strands and thread that through a needle. And so I'm just going to do what I did earlier, which is to take my needle up between these 2 gold doubled warp strand edges and then put my needle through the beads going over all of the vertical warp strands, and then I'm going to point my needle down and make it go under the 3-strand portion so that my thread will be under all of that, and we're ready to do our next row. Now, once you get used to beading the middle section, you can try what I'm doing here to speed up the process. What I'm doing is I'm just poking up just my needle between the two edges and then making my needle go through the beads and then putting my needle under the 3-row section. So basically, I'm doing everything with just my needle and pulling my thread through all in one go. So I'll show you that again here. So I'm sliding down all of the beads into their proper spaces. And then I'm just gonna poke my needle up between those two gold edges and putting my needle through all of the beads and then making my needle go under the 3-row section and then pulling in one go. So yeah, from here you can just continue beading, and I'll meet you again when we get to the bottom section, and I'll show you how we are going to weave through that so that we can start our 3rd section. Alright, so I'm about to do my last row, and I'm just sliding the beads down, and you just want to move the beads around a little bit so that you can fit that last row in, like that. Bring your needle up, and I'm just going to put my needle through this last row of beads and back down. So now I'm going to weave in through these beads a little bit and come right back to where I can start this 3rd strand. So actually what I'm going to do is, because this thread is ending on top of that warp strand, I'm just going to flip my loom, and so I just flipped it, and I'm just going to put my needle through this last row of beads, and I'm just going to come out on the other side. Alright, so all I've done was, after I've woven this last row, I flipped my loom and I made my needle go through the last row again from the bottom side, and then so that made my thread come out from this right side over here. So as you can see, it's coming from the bottom side. And now I'm just gonna go down one row and come out of the gold bead like this. And then I'm going to go down and I'm gonna come out of this pink bead right there. And then I'm going to go up to this row and come out of this pink bead right here. And this time I'm gonna put my needle under, in between these two edges. So I'm just gonna put my needle in between like that. So with that, I can just put my needle and all of my thread under, and I can just continue beading upwards. So it's not really an exact science. You just want to come out where you can just start your next strand. So here's my next row, and I'm gonna slide all the beads down and pop them up, and I'm going to bead like we normally do. So I'm going to come around and put my needle over top of the vertical strands and through each of the beads. And I'm going to actually just automatically point my needle down so that it can go under the next strand like this. So I'm just making my thread go under automatically. And now I've beaded my next row. So once again, just put your thread under all of the vertical warp strands. And here's my next row. So I'm just going to pop up my beads and put my needle over the vertical warp strands and through each of the beads and point my needle down so that I can put my thread under now and have it start below all of the beads. It'll be easier for me to start my next row. So from here, you're just going to continue and bead upwards, and I'll meet you back when you're done with this section and we're ready to tie off all of our threads. Alright, so I'm doing my last row now, and I'm just going to push these beads apart a little bit so I could squeeze my last row in there. Like that. And put my needle through. And pull that under. And just like what I did with the bottom, I'm going to flip the loom so I can put my needle through the last row of beads again, so I can come out on the right side like this. So now I'm coming out on the right side, and I'm gonna start getting ready to tie off. So to tie off, I'm just going to put my needle back through that last row. And then, I'm actually gonna get a bit closer. And then from here, I'm just gonna go back one row in the opposite direction. And come out just before the end, because I don't want my thread to be coming out of the end. I want it to be in the middle. And I'm going to go up one row and grab a thread bridge, and I'm going to draw a knot by drawing a loop and putting my needle through the loop and pulling, and that's going to draw a knot. And then now I'm going to go in the opposite direction and I can actually go pretty far if I wanted to, like all the way there, and pull my thread. And when I pull my thread, that's going to draw that knot into the bead to hide it. So to tie off, all I'm going to do is to draw a couple of knots and then do some zigzags and loops. So I've just done one knot here, so I'm just gonna go up one row and draw another knot by grabbing a thread bridge, which is the thread that is running between two beads. And when we're looming, we have a thread that's running under and another thread that's running over, and I'm only grabbing the over thread. And I'm going to put my needle through that loop and draw another knot like this. Then I'm going to go in the opposite direction. So I'm zigzagging, and going in the opposite direction and doing zigzags will allow us to lock in our thread and prevent it from unraveling and coming apart. So I'm going to go in the opposite direction like this. And now that I've done a couple of knots, I'm going to go ahead and do a couple of zigzags. So I've just drawn that knot into this bead to hide it. To do a zigzag, I'm just going to go up one and go in the opposite direction. Come out somewhere in the middle. Go up one and go again in the opposite direction. Come out somewhere in the middle again. And you can loop back by going back down and going around again. I'll come up somewhere out in the middle again. And going back up. So basically I'm just going around in a circle like this and looping back. And I'm gonna go up and go through this last row, and I'm gonna come out all the way till the very end. This last row is going to disappear into a sliding end tube clasp, so it doesn't matter if I come out of the very end. And I'm just going to cut my thread. So we're just going to do the same for all the other tails. So if you have two tails like this because you've added thread, then what I would do is I would cross them. So for this one, it's lower, so I would go in this direction when I'm zigzagging and tying off. And then this one, I would go in this direction when I'm doing zigzagging and tying off. And that will just ensure that I'm not overfilling a row with both of the threads, so that I don't clog up the rows with too much thread, and I can distribute these two threads across different rows. Also, if you see a little bump here from tying the thread on when you're putting on the new thread in the beginning, and you don't want that bump to be there, you can always just remove that knot before you start tying off your thread. Alright, so now that I've tied off all of the tail ends, I'm going to create a weaving on both edges so that I can create a little bit of a buffer between the last row of beads and the knots that I'm going to be tying to secure these vertical warp strands after we take it off of the loom. So I've put a couple feet of thread onto my size 10 beading needle, and I'm going to secure this thread by first tying a knot. So I'm just going to put my needle through a thread bridge on that last row, and I'm just going to tie a simple overhand knot to secure this thread onto that thread bridge. Like that. And I'm going to put my needle through this last row like this. And then I'm just going to pull that knot into a bead to hide it. And now to create a weaving, we're going to go under, over all of these warp strands. So I'm just going to go under, over, under, over, under, over, under, over, under, over. And I'm treating the doubled gold strands as one. So I'm just going to go over both and under both like this. And I'm going to pull my thread through. And I'm just going to use my needle to push the thread to the edge like this. And so I'm ending on an over, as you can see. This thread is going over that last strand, so I'm going to start by going under this time, and that will hook this thread on this last strand. So I'm going to go under, over, 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 under, and over, and pull. And once again, I'm just gonna push the thread into that edge like this. I'm just gonna cut off this tail because I don't need it anymore because this thread is already secure. And I'm only gonna go a couple more times, so I'm gonna make this edging very thin. So I'm just gonna go 1, 2, 3, 4 and end at the 4. Because once we tie the knots and glue the knots down, there's going to be some bulk there, and we don't want a huge bulk or it will not fit into the sliding end tube clasp. So here I'm ending on an over, as you can see. So I'm going to go under. And once you're done doing the back and forth, I'm going to tie a couple of knots. And I'm actually just going to put this thread into the middle by just going like that and exiting somewhere in the middle and cutting my thread. So just do the same for the other side. So after we've done our weaving, we can go ahead and remove the bracelet from the loom. And you also want to make sure to cut the loops so that we can tie the knots later. So I've laid some plastic down, and I've also secured my bracelet with a piece of tape so that it won't move around while I tie off the warp strands into knots. And to glue down the knots to make them more secure, I'm using E6000 PLUS, which I prefer over regular E6000 just because it is low odor. You should still use this with adequate ventilation, but this doesn't smell as bad as E6000, so it's a bit easier to work with. So I'm just going to squeeze a little bit onto the plastic So I'm going to work from left to right, and I'm going to grab my leftmost warp strand, and it's doubled, so I'm going to consider all the doubled strands as one. So I'm going to grab this leftmost warp strand and the next one over, and I'm going to tie a surgeon's knot to secure the warp strand. So to tie a surgeon's knot, I'm going to go left over right like this, and I'm going to put my tail through the loop twice. So that's once, and that's twice, and you're going to end up with something that looks very twisted like this. And I'm going to draw my knot close to the weaving, but before I fully close the knot, I'm going to use a scrap piece of wire, and I'm going to grab some E6000 glue. Now E6000 glue is very sticky, and it tends to stretch out like this, so it can get messy real fast. So just take a very tiny bit and work carefully and slowly so that it doesn't get everywhere and become a giant mess. So I'm just going to add a little bit of glue to the end so that when I draw my knot down, some glue is gonna get in there and secure this knot further, like that. Now, if this is a little bit hard to coordinate, you don't have to do this the way I'm doing it. You can always glue the knots afterwards also. So now that I've done my left over right, I'm now going to go right over left for my second knot. And I'm going to do 3. So let me just grab my thread. So now I'm going to go right over left like this, and put my tail through the loop just once this time, and draw that down. And then after doing right over left, now I'm going to go left over right and put my tail through the loop just once again and draw that down. So I'm just going to do that one more time. I'm going to grab this thread and the next one over. So the order that we are tying the knots is left over right, put it through the loop twice, right over left, put it through the loop once, and then left over right again and put it through the loop once. So let me just do that again. So left over right like this, and put it through the loop once and put it through the loop twice like this. And you're going to get something very twisted like this. And I'm going to draw my knot halfway down, and I'm going to add a tiny dab of glue over here, and I'm going to go ahead and pull my knot fully down. And you want to flush your knot against that weaving to make it nice and secure. Then I'm going to go right over left and put my tail through the loop once like this, and left over right and put my tail through once like that. So now I'm going to do the rest of my warp strands. Once you're done tying all of the knots, what I'm going to do is I'm going to gather up all my strands, And I'm going to actually put more glue over the knots and cover the knots with more E6000 glue. And I'm going to try not to make it too thick, but you definitely want to get enough glue in there that the knots and the weaving are secure. And then I'm also going to lift this up and also do the other side. So once you're done and you've added a good amount of glue on the knots and on the weaving, we can now do the other side. Alright, so once I'm done tying and gluing down all of my knots, what I like to do is I like to put my loom over the plastic and make sure that the loom doesn't touch any of the E6000 glue on the plastic, and lay my bracelet over the loom so that both ends are hanging over and not touching the plastic, which will just make it easier for me later on to cut off all the extra thread so that the glue doesn't stick to the plastic. And the glue takes 24 hours to cure, so I'm going to wait until tomorrow to cut off the thread and put in my sliding and tube clasps. Alright, so it's been about a day, and as you can see, the glue has cured and dried to a rubbery, gummy consistency. And so I'm going to go ahead and cut off my extra thread, and I'm going to leave a little bit of a tail so as to make sure I don't accidentally cut off any of my knots. And then I'm going to take some of my E6000 PLUS and put some on my plastic surface. So right now my sliding and tube clasp is open only about 45 degrees, so I'm going to open it up some more with my plier to about 90 degrees so it'll be easier for me to slide in my last row of beads later. And then I'm going to use a piece of scrap wire and take some glue and smear that inside of the end tube clasp, trying to avoid the open slotted area for extra security. And I'm going to start sliding my last row of beads into the sliding and tube clasp. And as you can see, I'm struggling a little bit because of all the extra bulk from the knots and the dried up glue. So I just try to use my fingernail to separate out that last row of beads to try to make it go in a little bit easier, and just go slow, and eventually you'll get it all in. Once I have everything inside, I'm going to close up the sliding and tube clasp back to about 45 degrees, and then I'm going to tap it closed the rest of the way on my table. Now I have a piece of thread sticking out, but don't worry, I'm just going to trim that off. So to wrap up, I'm going to be using a split ring, which is kind of like a keychain. It goes around in a coil, and I find that this is better than regular jump rings because the sliding and tube clasp loop is very thin metal and it tends to slip out of regular jump rings. So I prefer the split rings because there's no gap and it's more secure. So to open up the split ring, I will be using a split ring opener tool. So I'm just going to open it up like this. So I'm just going to drop down some charms that I've already made in advance and attach to a smaller split ring, as well as one side of my bracelet like this. So now that's attached. And same for the other side, I'm going to drop down a lobster clasp and the other side of my bracelet. So now both are attached. So here is the final result. It's very shimmery and pretty blinding. So yeah, if you're looking for something to wear to the Met Gala, then you can give this project a try. It's definitely very cute and eye-catching, so yeah. So yeah, here are the projects that we've done so far with the bead set. Thank you so much for joining me for this series. I hope that you enjoyed making everything, and if you are interested in the bead set, I will have them for sale at my Ko-fi shop, and I'll put a link in the description section below as well as in the comments section. And thank you so much, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!